All right, I thought I would make a video on my post. I made three comments that are reasonably long in text, but maybe they're short to say out loud. Of kind of why I support Sargon of Akkad and am right wing when I used to be a leftist. And it all ties together, but basically, someone was posting about cancel culture and communities versus like um affinity and familiarity replacing trust. So basically, here's what I said: the libs, the libs don't like Sargon of Akkad, bracket, and now the ethno nationalists don't like him either, end bracket. But he's also saying similar things about human level networks. Instead of the age of ideology, religion personalizes. Instead of the age of ideology, human level networks instead of the age of ideology. Sorry. Religion personalizes, which is why it's more stable than ideology. Granted, politics requires a certain degree of thinking about groups and systems, but making it a total machine is part of the problem. I also think the reason Trump has a big personality resonates is because of this. As a right winger, I don't think the answer is a communist mayor of New York becoming president or something like that. Ideology above people is a net negative generally, but I think it means we need to think of our own people first and not others from around the world in order for this to be manageable. Sargon's pointing out nation and ethnos both mean quote unquote a people, more or less, and I'm a diehard loyalist to him, and he's not disappointing me with mass deportation support. But he's not a purist; he's a securist of genetics, ethnic, or cultural, social variety. So as long as a minority, as minority, so as long as minorities stay minorities, and the native sons and daughters of Western nations hold primacy in population and sovereignty in their own lands, we don't need to really hate on the minorities unless there's something critically emphasized in their populations that's negative. And even then, the phrase, quote, the most racist man alive in his bracket, brown, black, end bracket, girlfriend, or quote, racists don't care what skin color you are, they just want you to be racist too, end quote, kind of speaks to a certain latent person driven nature to the right more so, which I think is what determines a lot of the reason why the right feels healthier than the left, which is system mechanic ideology oriented more so. We evolved in tribes and we still crave the close knit smaller circle than the whole world, close relations. This means we have boundaries to who's us and not us, but we also abstract out the family to the tribe, to the town, to the country, to the county, to the state, to the or province, to the nation, to the civilization, getting more porous slightly, not tons, as we extend outwards, or less concrete as we extend outwards. But there's always some sort of set of dividing lines. This is just fundamental to humans, and ignoring it is unhealthy. The left is tribal boundaries for Palestine, for example, but not Israel. The right is tribal boundaries for the Western nations, and sometimes, or sometimes not, for other nations. Oh, and of course, there's different tribes like hobbies or political beliefs or sports teams or friend groups or things like that. Then there's the ethics, morals, values, character, temperament, relations between people, different social media website user groups or pools. There's a lot of distinction to be made in categories, and trying to blend them all together harms the particularity and diversity that actually exist within a nation or civilization. And for most people, their own civilization has plenty of diversity within a coherent framework. That's important. Within a coherent framework is important with the diversity. So they don't need a lot of foreigners to spice things up, who often run rabidly contrary to the host nation or civilization when from a different civilization. All of this is also to say something made for everyone is basically made for no one, particularly in art, culture, or hobbies often, which is why lots of people got pissed off at Games Workshop when they added female Adeptus Custodes as like the female Space Marines compromise, and the perennial complaint that cool niche things get ruined by becoming mainstream. Make something unique and have some degree of symbolic value or just plain fun game mechanics or something, and you're bound to find someone who shares liking it. I think the siloing of the internet in some ways might be a good thing so that people don't have to deal with a million other people. There's 8,000 million people in the world who hate them. Just enforce a cultural understanding that it's okay to have your own group or hobby, and as long as you aren't harming people with it, it should be allowed. Even when you publicly declare your hobby, you get made fun of for being lame. Which brings us to politics, which is the quote what everyone should do end quote topic to everyone who practices politics. The catastrophizing ramping up does everyone a disservice, led in part by the stress and cortisol, adrenaline and dopamine of pissing each other off for disagreeing with each other in a vicious feedback loop. This I distinctly blame the left for starting more or less, as they're the ones that started the whole quote the personal is political end quote angle. And I'm saying this as someone who was a leftist and was participating in making that happen. I remember being overjoyed that the message and the quote unquote the message was part of cultural stuff. Um, Now I know why it happened in some ways. Um, because there was a lack of reality in culture or lives in some sense because of the decay of the economic system to some extent by the time of 2008. Um, or even slightly after. Um, Hobbies felt really childish, even though they were higher quality than they are now. A lot of mainstream stuff is just absolutely man child compared to before, back in the day. It deals with like childish morals and childish, unserious situations, and it's irony poisoned and stuff like that. And it's like it's just childish. You know what I mean? Like it's just simple-minded and like bratty and annoying and selfish and stuff like that. And basically, the hunger for serious, actually important things is part of this development of a soul. And what I mean by that is there's three spheres of life according to Kierkegaard, and we see it happening in real time. And I'll describe how it's happening in real time nowadays. Um, and so on. So, according to Kierkegaard, there's three spheres: the aesthetic, which is like food, drink, games, stuff like that; the ethical, which is like activism or politics or something like that; and the religious, which is more personal again, not universal like the ethical, but personal like the aesthetic, but more serious about cultivating yourself. Now, you might argue that you don't need God, but I'm pretty sure you kind of need God because I mentioned, as I was saying earlier, um, religion is a personalizing force, and you need to come back to the personal. So basically, the three spheres are aesthetic, self; ethical, universal; and religious, the big other. And the big other is God, basically. You need God for this. And Christianity Whatever the faults you may nitpick about it as an atheist is unironically the absolute best of it. And it's indispensable if you want to get to the third sphere of refinement. And if you're at the. And basically, the thing is, the the aesthetic guy gets tired of hedonism and looks for meaning and purpose and finds it to begin with in the ethical or universal sphere. So it's like, okay, I'm going to manage the lives of lots of people or be big and important and influential. But that actually loses its luster for some people as well. So then they move on to the religious sphere and start cultivating their soul instead of like eating chips and drinking pop all day and playing video games all day or bossing everyone around or something. You know. And the religious is particular in a higher way than the universal. So you might say, for instance, I'll give an example of justice. Killing people is wrong, but killing a murderer is not wrong. So the religious sphere is killing a murderer is not wrong, and the ethical sphere is killing a murderer or killing people is wrong. And the aesthetic sphere is I killed them because I wanted to feel the rush of adrenaline from killing someone. It's kind of like stages of moral development or um, Ho math popularized this with the levels of thinking. Ho math levels of thinking, but it's like someone else's model before his. And basically, you need the IQ as a prerequisite, but it's not sufficient. You need the experience and the self awareness and the time to process and ponder and think through the lessons of life and the jagged edges or the outcroppings, the greebles, as they're called, the little things that stick out that don't make any sense, or like at first, or like they don't, you don't know how they actually. It doesn't seem necessary, but it makes the thing like look good on a science fiction ship, spaceship or something. You know, it like completes the thing, completes the picture. The Greebles. Um, the Greebles of life are not nonsense. They're important particularities sometimes or often. And to be experienced and learn from your mistakes and be self aware is to be able to map those better than if you were just a universalist. Like, for instance, I'll give an example. On a Star Destroyer, um, the universal will be the triangle or dagger shape of the thing. The Greebles might be, for instance, those two little ball things on the top of the bridge at the back of the Star Destroyer. Those are the shield generators. Now you could make a dagger and tape a Thor's hammer to the dagger's backside minus the handle, and you would get roughly a Star Destroyer. But the Greebles, the shield generators, or the things in between the top and bottom plates of the Star Destroyer, because if you remember, there's actually a section in the middle, like like at the centerpiece of the Star Destroyer, where there's all these little weird like doohickeys and gizmos, or like um uh well it's agreeable. It's basically the random stuff that you just attach to something to make it look more cool. Yeah. And the greebles are not quite as important as the basic shape, but they add something to it that is lacking otherwise for a greater effect. And that's what experience, self awareness, and learning from mistakes and experience gets you. And you need to have a certain level of IQ to reach the top potentially, but you're not guaranteed to reach your actual potential if you're prideful, which is why pride is a dangerous thing. Because it prevents you from learning from mistakes because you assume you didn't make a mistake. Someone else is wrong, never yourself. And basically, the aesthetic is the dagger, the ethical is adding the bridge little hammer shaped thing on the top back of the ship, and the greebles are like the religious sphere basically. And what happened is society became simpler and simpler and more slop as time went on because people weren't facing heroic things. And then they moved to the ethical sphere in a bid to find meaning and purpose. Because nature abhors a vacuum or doesn't hates a vacuum and fills it up automatically. And meaning and purpose are non-negotiable in a human life for the long term. You know, you're just a miserable, suicidal person if you don't have meaning in your life. And so that's why the first step was taken. And now people are turning to religion again, but they're still kind of in the ethical sphere. And by the way, when I say ethical, I don't mean just like that's a good moral thing. I mean it's like the universal considerations of how everyone should be kind of ethical. It's the universal part of it, not necessarily it's the good behavior part of it in actuality. It's trying to get there, but it's not necessarily there. The religious sphere actually gets you into being a good person and content with yourself and so on. But it doesn't just stop at the religious sphere. You Once you complete the religious sphere or get it down pretty good, you actually begin to be able to I think we all do this a little bit, but like you begin to master the transition between aesthetic, ethical, and religious modes of thinking. So you can inhabit each of them fluidly. I don't know if it's on your command or God's command exactly, but I'll sort of say it's like, well, if you watch my previous video, you know, I was saying like God kind of feeds into you what you need to be good. So it's kind of like you're good, but only because God is like feeding you what's necessary to be good. And like that's like the self-reliant versus God-reliant kind of thing. So you don't want to be prideful and me. You want to be humble and God is how to resolve that issue if you're looking into it. Um, but you begin to think in the what I enjoy, how everyone should be, and how I should be, um, or what is healthy for me to be for myself and other people, um, kind of thing. And you master all three levels after you build this. That you start with the aesthetic, you build to the ethical, you build to the religious, and then you master transitioning between all three modes of thinking as per what the situation calls for. And and this is important, but the Greebles actually are particular and they're possibly counterintuitive, so you can't just logic it out. You have to experience something related to it somehow. So that's what the lived experience from the leftists and the just be better kind of stuff is about. But what I will posit or offer is that the left is very mechanistic or systemic, or ideologically driven naturally in their predisposition. Like I used to be as an INTP. But as an INTP, I grew eventually to become more personal oriented, which is why I transitioned to the right wing, more or less, as a liberal reactionary, minus neoliberalism's part of it. And that's why they say the right can understand the left, but the left cannot understand the right. The right says the left are insane, and the left says the right are evil because the left cannot understand the right, and the right do understand the left. And the left is objectively, typically, on a lower level in many ways, not always, but many times. The stereotypical leftist is objectively on the ethical sphere, which is lower than the religious sphere, which is again more personal, other oriented, the big other, God. And then the commandment that's Christian is love your neighbor as yourself. But then the trick is love doesn't mean fuzzy feelings or just being kind and like giving someone everything they want. Love means willing the good of the other. And you have to make trade offs for who you benefit. So, going back to first principles as a reactionary is actually a wise move if you want to fix society, because when you overextend empathy, you start caring more about people who really do nasty violence. I'm not talking silence is violence, and I'm not talking about words of violence. I'm talking about actual violence. You overextend empathy to people who do actual violence a lot, and you shut off the sympathy because you're too busy empathizing with the criminal. You shut off the sympathy to the victim. And again, the reason for mass deportations is because it's our country, not the foreigners or minorities' country, unless they've been here for a long, long time, in which case they're part of our country. And I mean like 3 generations of being here, not two or one. Well, that's my definition, my dividing line of that. But you know what I mean. Um, yeah, yeah. You don't have to share that dividing line, but that's my dividing line, roughly speaking. My estimate, at least. Kind of a guesstimate, actually. But I hope I'm explaining why, like this is my belief and understanding of the world as my own right winger, basically, who likes Sargon of Akkad and finds his worldview to be enchanting and like appropriate and stuff like that. Like this is what I think he's trying to get at somewhat, and this is my own formulation of it. as a systemically minded individual, an INTP. He's more of an ENTJ, so he's more person oriented to begin with, but I'm more systems oriented, so I can possibly explain the whole thing in a way that makes it more approachable in concept to someone who isn't sharing intrinsically the understanding or beliefs that Sargon or I have, essentially. Um, so, yeah. Yeah. Also, I was a former leftist, so I think I understand something about how to talk to them as someone who was naturally a leftist and then got dragged kicking and screaming away from it by the repeated transgressions upon my values by the left. At least as far as I could see, which is why I moved away from the left after being like 90% woke. Like, like Hassan Piker is like a slightly more woke than I was, slightly. Yeah. Um, only slightly. So this is my sharing of my hard-earned, hopefully, wisdom and why I believe what I believe, I guess, in some sense, or an explanation of what I believe, and a formula or hierarchy or schematic of the 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 ground upon which we all are operating on, and so on. And when I said going back to first principles as reactionary is a wise thing to get power, the alternative of the overemphasizing empathy for the criminal and shutting out the victim's feelings is that basically my quote is, if you will, the reactionaries are going back to first principles, basic justice, to be handed power as they rightly should be, where the progressives or the leftists are going forwards off a cliff mentally and morally. And as for the third worlders or the Muslims or the Israeli and so on, or the Chinese, they're not Christian. So their first principles are inferior to the Christian principles. Basically, they're serviceable in their own societies, but they're not the best we can achieve as people, and so on. However, I'm not for translating our society onto theirs artificially through imperialism or colonization or something like that. They need to work with what they've got, and we need to work with what we've got. And while we'll be better off than them with what we've got, and they'll be better off than they would be with our working with um sorry, how do I put this? A Chinese man with Chinese values is better off than a Chinese man with Christian values in China. But a Christian man with Christian values is better off in Christianity than a Chinese man with Chinese values in China. That's my fundamental prognosis or description or whatever. Now, I will touch on the racial thing, but basically, there's an argument to be had that biological norms within a rough ethnic population contribute to certain proclivities or natural dispositions that tend towards certain ways of life being much more sustainable than others in from other parts of the world. So it's not necessarily like blacks are not people, but it's saying blacks are their own people and we can't superimpose our culture onto them, and also we can't really import them into our culture en masse and have a good time for either situation for lots of people. So, I'll finish with this, but basically, I'll just give a really offensive take or offensive wording of what I just said. Um, I'm a Western supremacist, a Christendom supremacist, a white supremacist, let's say. But because I believe my people are superior, I will uphold them to a higher standard that I believe they can achieve. However, it will not be totally divorced from the common human experience of those abstracting tribes. I will bet that us on our own can be better off than them on their own, but basically, my belief is that we should leave them alone and they should leave us alone. And therefore, we'll all be better off than if we didn't leave each other alone. So it's not necessarily I want to purge, like I'm not for the great replacement of like the white race by coloreds, but I'm also not for the total purging of foreigners from society. I just want them back to a manageable level with demographic security for our people and to maintain the population growth or decline based on our own people's ability to have children. Because I want my own children and I want more of my people to have my own children. I don't mind if other people have more children as well, as long as they can sustain them on their own, basically, as a people. But I want my people to be able to sustain more people in our culture. And importing competition for resources and stuff like that, while also promoting envious redistribution, which is not production oriented but is redistribution oriented, basically shrinks the pie compared to what it could be at least, um, because of the envious redistribution, disincentivizing people because you just take from people who make things to give to people who didn't make anything. Which is also why bureaucracy and service economy focused societies fail economically. Um, and that's my reason for being anti socialist in some sense. I explained my three layers of economics in the previous video. Go ahead and watch that. But basically, that's my stance. Basically, it's just like a healthy free market that's very strong, lots of competition internal to the nation and civilization, potential for nationalizing or provincializing or statizing. I don't mean the nation state necessarily. I mean the country, the state, or province rather, like province or state, and the country nationalizing or socializing natural monopolies. Natural monopolies. Something like the internet or roads or something like that. And police and fire and ambulance. Or, sorry, police and fire, I should say. And roads. And like utilities or internet. Those things I want nationalized. Or trains or something like that. Passenger trains or something like that. Um, because they're natural monopolies. They're not forced to be a monopoly. Education, I don't think, should be monopolized by the state. Um, Healthcare, I think, should actually be a mixed system. I think we'd actually be better off if we had a basic option for social health care and a thriving private industry for private health care. But, that's enough about that. The third dimension of the layers of free market, natural monopoly, socialization is the social safety net. I am for basic welfare and basic disability. Now, the thing is, I actually have a good reason for this as someone that's on disability, which is that 15 years ago, when the free markets were a bigger thing, um, my disability paid twice as much or slightly more than twice as much of rent in a good location. Under more socialistic uh, government for the last 7 to 8 years, 9 years, that disability turned into 60% of the same buying power as before, 15 years ago under capitalism or free markets. Because there's a difference between free markets and capitalism. Capitalism includes, like, if you have capitalism, then it's kind of mega corporation potential. But if you have free markets, it's more emphasis on community or small business or family business. There's more competition because there's more small businesses. And like there's neoliberalism and socialism. And neoliberalism is basically when government and business get in bed together at first for like subsidies and tax breaks and stuff, and like then it evolves into socialism through a lot of being led down the garden path, and then things get even worse, and it sucks for everyone, and no one knows how to get out of it at first, and like you got to think your way back to first principles and so on. But basically, I was paid more on disability alone by like I was paid. I am paid 60% as much money as I was paid on disability alone 15 years ago under capitalism, to simplify it. Now that I'm under socialism with disability and a subsidy. If it wasn't for the subsidy, I'd be paid like 48% of what I was paid before on disability. So like there's like actual like historical, like I know for a fact I've experienced it, kind of argumentation for, yeah, it actually does negate like the lowest rung of society's well-being to be socialist. It's not what it advertises. I'm living proof of it with my experiences and memories of how these things changed and what happened and so on. And inflation is a big driver of the reason why the money dried up essentially. The perpetual borrowing led to inflation, which made money worth less. Not worthless, which will happen if we keep borrowing, but worth less. And, and if you want to learn more about that, learn the difference between Keynesianism, Keynesianism, and the Austrian School of Economics or the Chicago School of Economics. That will explain a lot of my reason for all this in some sense. I'm an Austrian or Chicago School economics guy mostly, but I'm kind of like Milton Friedman, where he said there's a place for social services potentially and so on. Keynesianism is basically the big bailouts, Obama's bailouts of the banks, or like print money, print money, print money, print money, or borrow, 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 and never pay off the debt. And that's a bad thing. Because sooner or later, the consequences. Well, there's actually a phrase that Thomas Sowell, who's a decent mind, he's a pretty good mind, says, which is you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. And basically, that's a lesson we're going to learn the easy way or the hard way. And the sooner we learn it, the easier it'll be to deal with, as hard as it is right now.